Glory to you, O God of hope. Glory to you, Heavenly King, Comforter, the Spirit of truth, present in all places, filling all things, treasure of blessings and giver of life. Come and abide in us and cleanse us from our iniquities and save our souls, a good one. Amen. Okay. Yeah, welcome, everybody. Nice to be with you today. Topic is on your Catechism series, marriage and monasticism. So to keep me on the level, I brought my wife with me. So this is instead of Georgia. so so we've been married for 25. Is it 25?
26 in June.
Yes. Okay. 20, almost 26 years. So whatever I say about marriage is more than just theory. Okay. So are you married or
We're going
planning
to get married
to?
December 2nd at Ascension.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Okay. And how about you two?
Been married like a year and a half.
You've been married a year and a half. Okay. All right. Ryan?
I'm not married now.
Not married. Okay. Okay. Not planning to.
Not right now.
Okay. All right. And so where are you from?
I'm from Wilmette.
Wilmette. Okay. And what brought you to this class?
Well, I took actually the class last in fall.
Okay.
Retaking it.
So second time around. What happened? You failed the exam at the end?
Well, there's a couple classes I missed.
Okay. All right. Okay. So you're making up some classes. Okay. Excellent. How about you two?
I grew up with this parish and
Okay.
got married here almost a couple years ago. Actually, we have two twins, babies at home, and
Oh boy.
they're getting baptized pretty soon after Bosca, and
Okay.
so I thought it was a good time to refresh.
Refresh a little bit. Okay.
And my wife will be getting chrismated.
Oh, okay. Where church you grew up in?
Catholic, so I grew up at St. Mary's in Buffalo Grove.
Okay. You did it all? CCD, First Communion?
Mhm.
Okay. And
Not
what-
all there. I lived in California when I was little, so
Ah,
mostly out there for all my sacraments. But,
okay. Did you go to Catholic school too?
no, I didn't.
No.
Oh, well, I have one Catholic school over the years. But,
All right.
but always went to Sunday school, always, went through the whole
Mhm.
program.
Okay. How's the transition going so far?
Wonderful. I definitely felt the calling. We want to have our family have one faith, but I'm Jewish and I feel a calling to convert.
Excellent. Well, it's a short trip from Catholicism, so it's not a very long journey. So I'm sure you'll find your way just fine. Well, you two.
I'm from Schaumburg, but I actually grew up at this parish too, also,
Okay.
John. And we're getting married in December, and she's going to get baptized after this catechism classes. So
Okay.
Yeah.
goes together.
Yeah, he's just supporting me, coming to what classes that he can make. And,
Nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
I've never been baptized.
Never been baptized.
Mm-mm.
Okay. All right.
No.
So, I mean,
Just grew up like Christian, went to like Sunday school sometimes with my neighbor, like would go to church on holidays, but not
okay.
religiously go to church. Yeah.
So kind
But
of,
yeah, but we've been dating like 6 years and been going to church with Teddy, and yeah, really like it. And it's important to me to start off our marriage and in a religion and raise a family in one faith. So
excellent.
yeah.
So you were exposed to Christianity, but just never
yeah,
like formally,
Yeah.
and basically never baptized. And
yeah.
your parents set up like, do they practice at all, or do they?
Not really.
Not really.
No,
Okay.
yeah.
But did they identify themselves as Christian?
Yeah.
They did.
Mhm.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So, all
Yeah,
right.
my sister actually just got married last year, and she went through Catholic school and
Mhm.
got baptized Catholic because her husband is Catholic. So we're kind of like doing the same thing
Okay.
on our own paths. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
But you got to be baptized. So,
Yeah.
it's going
Yeah.
to be all out
Mhm.
kind of sense. So,
Mhm.
it will be a beautiful day. Have you picked a baptism date yet?
No, not yet.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. It's sometime between now and December.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Whenever your heart says you're ready, that's
Yeah.
all that matters. So,
Yeah.
okay. Well, I'm glad that we have recently married, soon to be married, and one day, finding the right person. And this part of the catechism is marriage and maybe monasticism, Mr. Ryan. So, you never know. But I was kind of wondering, like, how did this, topic get to be kind of paired up? I don't know if they ran out of weeks, but it's actually from our perspective, they're very, very similar, and there's a reason why they are together. It's not just like let's kind of jam in monasticism with something else, because they are the goal is the same, right? So the goal is the same. The goal is, that we become what God intended us to be, inheritors of the kingdom of heaven. That's what every parent wants their child to receive, all that you can give them, right? And what God wants to give us is himself, wants to give us the kingdom, wants to be with us. And that's our goal, whether you are going to be married in this life or not. The goal is the same. Two paths, so to say, but the destination, is definitely the same. So therefore, since the destination is the same, there's a lot of common characteristics between marriage and monasticism. So let me share my screen so that if I can figure out how to do it. All right. Okay. Slideshow. Okay. So marriage and monasticism, they're both paths to salvation. Okay. Salvation means what? What does it mean to be saved? Huh? I mean, that's why we're here, right? Is the whole hullabaloo we do, about baptism and sacraments and receiving communion and following the gospel, right? Salvation is to be made whole, right? And the Greek word is soteria. Sos means whole, right? To be a whole person, okay? To be a whole person. And since the path is salvation means to be a whole person, right? Whether you follow one path or another, right? The point is to be whole, to be an entire person. So why I say that? In my previous life, I was a math person. Okay, how many of you are math people? Anybody? No math people here? And I did not marry a math person either. She married me for my math. But all right. I often hear at weddings, I found my other half or my soul mate, right? Another person completes me, right? And that doesn't work. Okay, recently married, future married, maybe you're not, right? Two halves, right, do not make a whole person, right? One of the basic things that you learn in the Catechism class, like our God is actually three but one, right? So you learn how to do the sign of the cross. The only way that works is what? Three gods making one. The relationship between them is a multiplication relationship. 1 times 1 times 1 equals 1. If we transfer that for people, right? If you are half and your spouse is half times a half makes what's half of a pizza? Right? A quarter, right? Half times a half makes a quarter. You make less than what you started with. The only way for the two to become one, for you to remain one, is for the two of you to come together, right, as a whole person. So marriage and monasticism, the goal is salvation, which means you have to be whole. The other person doesn't complete you, right? God completes you. And that's why marriage and monasticism have the same goal. God completes you, not the other person. Okay? You might have different roles. You might have a math person and a non-math person. But that doesn't mean that you're not a whole person. You have to stand on your own 2 feet. That's why you don't marry a project. That's why you don't marry somebody who you hope to change. You don't marry somebody who complements, some kind of shortcomings that you have for yourself. You should work on your shortcomings. The other person should work on their shortcomings. Okay, and help each other do that. But we're dependent only on God and not sort of an interdependency. That's why when you go to a marriage service, there's no vows to each other. The vow is to God. The relationship is always vertical and then horizontal. And that's why whether you're married or you're monastic, what's the important part of that relationship is the vertical. God is the one that completes you. Okay? So let's talk about marriage. How did marriage come to be? Well, we are in a difficult marriage state these days. How do I move this along? Anybody know? Stop. How do I move this along?
I don't know. Did I enter or-
PowerPoint.
It's a PowerPoint.
Hit Spacebar.
Try that. Oh, not moving. Okay. Stop sharing. Next slide. Okay. So there we go. So two paths to marriage, how different are they? Again, are there two classes of Christians? Are there different expectations, right? There is no two classes of Christians. Our goal is the same. Salvation is to be whole. Therefore, the expectations is for you to be a whole person. Now, the state of marriage in our days is falling, right? So I'm also a statistics person. So when I watch this, I get worried, right? The institution of marriage, not just in the Orthodox Church, but also in society in general, is something that is being put aside, right? Just live for a long time before getting married, or never getting married at all, right? Or just deciding not to have, in our case, a church wedding, because what's the point of a church wedding, right? Why not get married on a beach? Why not get married on in a nice forest preserve? And state of marriage is has been evolving over years. So we're going to take a study and see what has marriage been over time. So this image is a little blurry, right? But it's basically King David and all his wives, all 700 of them. Okay, so definitely marriage has evolved over time. So where did it start? It started with the first couple, right? Adam and Eve. Adam was alone. Adam was lonely. God created all of his creatures in front of him. Adam named them all, and yet he felt lonely. Some of them physically looked like him, but it was not the same until Christ intervened, put Adam to sleep, and took one of his ribs, right? That's what the passage says, right? And then God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs, he closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which God had taken from man, he made into a woman, he brought her to the man. Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. It shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife. The two shall become one flesh." Okay, a passage that is repeated often in the wedding service. So what do you have? You have the creation of, the institution of this relationship, of this marriage relationship, which was very different in the Garden of Eden. Okay, very different. So how did it begin? Began with piece of Adam, right? Rib, not the head, not the feet. Taking something from the middle means that there's a equality of, right, of nature, right? It's the same nature. God intended for the two to be different but equal. Okay, different but equal. Adam, when he woke up from this deep sleep, didn't say, "Oh, there's a rib missing. There's a woman over there. She must be from." Didn't know. What was it that made Adam say, "Oh, bone of my bones and flesh shall be my flesh shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man"? What does that mean? There was something about Adam, there was something about Eve that made him different from every other creature that God made. What was the difference between man and woman and all other creatures? Bipods, tetrapods. What was different about it? What was different? God breathed into them, right? They had a soul. They had a light or an aura about them. Okay? So when Adam saw Eve, it wasn't because she was physically similar that he said, this is bone of my bones, nor did he say, oh, there's a rib missing. Okay, because how would that make, sense? I mean, here's a little piece of rib missing. There's a whole person standing in front of him, right? The whole person standing in front of him was another being that was surrounded by this light, right? The uncreated light that we call, right, which was the breath of God. Okay, that's why he knew it was flesh of his flesh and bone of my bones. Finally, I have a helpmate, somebody who is like me, somebody who is a whole person, a body and soul made in the image and likeness of God. That's what he saw. And in the Garden of Eden, they both had equal roles, right? Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. Okay, right? The two shall be joined together, right? It shall be one flesh, right? There was absolute equality and harmony between the two genders. Marriage was to tend to the Garden of Eden, to tend to basically each other's soul, to tend to each other's obedience. How many commandments did they have in the Garden of Eden? Yeah, technically two. Be fruitful and multiply. And the other one, the one they violated, which was, do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Basically, don't eat of that tree. Okay, because we all know the story. You probably covered it, right? What happened? As my Presidenta says, Eve was never told firsthand. It's true. It wasn't her fault, right? When God gave the commandment, Adam was only there. Eve only heard it secondhand. Okay? So Eve getting tricked by the devil, right? Whose fault was it? It was really Adam's fault. Adam should have looked out for Eve. Eve should have said, hey, Adam, didn't you say something about this tree? Right? I thought you mentioned something. You had given me a memo or something, but don't eat of that one, right? But they didn't look out for each other. That was the problem. So since they didn't look out for each other, we have what we call the fall. With the fall, it's not just the fall of human nature, but all things associated with it, including the fact that we're no longer immortal. Adam and Eve were made immortal. That's why they're equal. That's why they have different roles, but complete equality. After the fall, everything, right, is distorted. Everything is sort of, corrupted. Everything is given an less than intended state of being, including marriage, right? So in marriage, while the point is to come back to the Garden of Eden, to come back to paradise, but to come back how? Well, after they refused to ask forgiveness, God had to say, hey, you can't live here anymore, right? They refused to look out for each other in the Garden of Eden. It's like, well, if you don't learn how to look out for each other here, you have to look out for each other somewhere else, right? And then he said to them, to the woman, he said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain, you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and you shall rule over you. Then to Adam, he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field, and the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. Okay, get the story, right? So where things before were painless, there was no pain, there was no death, there was no thorns, there was no sweat. The ground just gave forth fruit. You didn't have to till it. All you had to do is look out for each other. Okay? Be true, be whole persons, be true to each other. Since you weren't managed to do that, well, then you have to figure out how to regain that, and you will do so through Christ much, much later. Okay? But in the meantime, right, even that relationship, that first relationship between human beings became something other than what was intended. Okay? So we have a lot of things in being part of the fallen nature that we can gripe about. You know, that we are mortal, that we go through pain, that we go through illness, that we're susceptible to wild beasts and natural disasters and each other's bad intentions, and that there's evil in the world. And that in marriage, we can't figure out who is supposed to do what, right? What are our roles? Why, we fight about equality about in all things, even to this day, right? Whether it's equality in the workplace, equality in wages, right? Equality in social norms, equality and for all groups and all genders, and now we have lots of genders and so on and so forth, and try to find equality for everyone. Okay, but equality without God is impossible. So marriage today is a sacrament because in that we're trying to recover, right? Recover what it means to be whole. It took a while, right? So you see that Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, and they put on skins, right? Different clothing, right? To show that they're fallen nature. And then things were not really right away, kind of lived out to what it was intended. So you have lots of examples in the Old Testament that have you scratch your head. Okay, what do you have? You have Adam and Sarah and Hagar. Okay, anyone familiar with the story of those three? Right, Abraham and Sarah. Have you heard about Abraham and Sarah? Right, in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, right? Adam and Eve are expelled, people are born, Cain kills Abel, you have Noah's flood, right? And then you have this person called Abraham. Abraham believes in God. How? Did he hear a good story from his grandparents? How did he come to believe? We don't know. Okay? But he does believe, right? The story of Abraham is about a person who believes that God is real. Okay? We're all children of Abraham, right? In faith, because Abraham believed. Abraham was promised a descendant by God. It was promised that he would be the father of many nations. He was 74 years old when he had heard that promise, and God told him he's going to have a son. His wife is 70. He's like, what are you talking about? But he believed. Abraham and Sarah were not to give birth to a child till well in their 90s. 24 years after God promised Abraham and Sarah that they could have a child, that's when they had a child. Before that, Abraham and Sarah were waiting, right? So Abraham, Sarah in their 70s, God gives them a promise. Sarah, when she heard the promise, she laughed. Abraham believed, or tried to believe. Sarah thought, well, maybe Abraham's supposed to have a son, but maybe not with me. So what did she do? She takes Hagar, one of her maidservants, is like, maybe you're supposed to have a son with her. Okay? And Abraham has a son with Hagar. Right? I mean, messed up, isn't it? But at that time, it wasn't really a huge deal. This marriage, as we know it today, right, is not what it was. It took a long, long time. And you have instances like that. Jacob is the grandson of Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham has Sarah has Isaac. Isaac has two sons. There were twins, Jacob and Esau. Jacob runs away from the home, goes to his mother's cousin's house. He sees what basically are also his cousins that he's never met. He sees Rachel first. He falls in love with Rachel, she was drawing water at the well. Goes up to her father Laban, says, I want to marry your daughter. Well, it's like, no, I need some help around here. So why don't you come work for me? And then after 7 years, you can marry my daughter. So 7 years go by. Jacob gets married to Rachel's sister. They basically tricked him. It's like Laban's like, wait a second. What'd you do to me? It's like, well, in our house, the older sister gets married first. It's like, well, I didn't want her. It's like, well, you're going to get her anyway. So Guess what? He gets married to Leah. If you want to marry, but I want to marry Rachel, well, then you have to work another 7 years. So he worked 7 years for what he thought was going to marry, and then another 7 years to get the one he wanted to marry. So he was married to 2 sisters. Again, in modern standards, right? Sounds kind of messed up, right? And then God does begin to draw some lines, right? What line did he draw at Sodom and Gomorrah? That, right? The mystery of procreation, or the mystery of the sexual drive, so to say, right, was something to be controlled, right? So Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, well, there shall be no relationship between men and men or women and women. Okay, it's supposed to be, so start drawing lines. Okay, God starts drawing lines. Until then, it was kind of basically a free-for-all, right? You can sleep with your wife's maidservant, or you can marry 2 sisters, right? So on and so forth. So God started to draw lines. First line he kind of drew was like, okay, well, man has fallen, right? He figured he doesn't remember who God is, doesn't remember what marriage is supposed to be, don't understand the mystery of marriage, right? And, well, we have to start to kind of put some lines around it. First line he put was this line, right? About people lying, with the same gender. So that was set. Then, one of my favorite stories was David, right? King David, like I said, how many wives did we say she had? Like several hundred of them, right? However, they were legally given to him. They were unattached. And then David sees Bathsheba taking a bath, right? First case of peeping Tom in the Old Testament, okay? Sees her taking a bath, but she happens to be the wife of someone else, right? His name was Uriah. Uriah was in David's army. David's the king. He calls his general over and says, hey, you know that guy Uriah? No, make sure the next battle, just kind of put him in the front, and if he gets, wounded, let's just kind of leave him there, right? So sure enough, Uriah dies. David, being the nice guy he was, brings Bathsheba into his house. Now, it was not wrong to marry a widow, but it was wrong to marry a widow whose husband you killed, okay? So again, lines, right? Start drawing some lines, trying to understand, right? So we go from basically free-for-all to some lines to now more lines. We get down to the time of John the Baptist. John the Baptist, right? How did he get in trouble? You heard about John the Baptist, right? John the Baptist is Jesus' cousin. He's out in the desert proclaiming, right, repentance. And one of the harshest, subject of his criticism was King Herod. King Herod had married his brother's wife and says it's wrong to take the wife away from your brother. And that's how he lost his head. Okay. But you see, the norms about what marriage should be are getting closer and closer to what, they are. So you have the fall. After the fall, it was kind of just like really free for all. All it was basically no laws at all. And then God slowly putting some laws around this idea of how we relate to one another. So at the end of the Old Testament, you kind of have this first holy couples, right? So in this icon here, you see Joachim and Anna, who gave birth to the Virgin Mary, right? Zacharias and Elizabeth, who gave birth to John. So you have pious couples, both cases sterile, okay? And given birth to one, the Virgin Mary, the other one to John the Baptist, after many, many years of a blessed life of being together and being devoted to God. And their offspring come from normal procreation, but always with the hand of God, meaning that they were sterile, right? And childless until a very, very old age, where only by God's intervention they could have, given birth to a child. Okay? And having given birth to their children, obviously they become the 2 most important persons of the Old Testament and a bridge to the New. But their parents, right, out of this sort of sterile environment where nothing was really sacred, about marriage in a sense, the way we understand it today. You have this sort of gradual, placing limitation and showing forth at least some examples of righteous relationships, marriage relationship. So the Old Testament view of marriage, basically what you had is a continuation of the human race, right? Abraham, Adam and Eve, until Abraham, you have to continue the human race. He has to keep on going. What God promised Eve, that one of your descendants would bring you back, which was Jesus Christ. From Abraham till Christ, you have the continuation of the Hebrew race, meaning the children of Abraham. Okay? The primary factor wasn't, the cynical person would say it was just lust. In some cases it was. But really, why did David have 700 wives? Is the desire for descendants. To have a lot of descendants was considered a blessing from God. Okay? Because if you have lots of descendants, one of them or one of their descendants would be the Christ, which actually it happened, right? So the desire wasn't just, we can claim that it was all kinds of reasons, but really the desire was, the blessing was to have descendants. You have a gradual revelation of what God's intention was for marriage, okay? Gradual revelation. Limitation from here, limitation from there, what was legal, what was not in the eyes of God, right? All we got in the Old Testament really was like, do not commit adultery. But, it didn't really say what that meant, right? And what you're supposed to do with it or how you're supposed to get to that point. So then you have miraculous birth of important figures like John the Baptist, Virgin Mary, right? Marriage as a mystery, the presence of God or the presence of holiness in a marriage, slowly revealed basically at the very end of the Old Testament, giving birth to its very important figures, right, in our lives. So that's Old Testament. Okay? What we think we know about marriage, we think that it's eternal, but it's not, because marriage as we know it is a construct. Okay? It's a construct. Remember, in the next life, there'll be no marriage, or at least marriage will be what it was in the Garden of Eden. If we are immortal, the need for descendants is not the primary reason for coming together. The goal of marriage is not having children. The goal of marriage is to watch out for each other and save each other, make each other whole, or at least preserve the wholeness of each other. Okay? It's not procreation. In the Old Testament, all it was procreation. And yes, probably a little bit of lust and, uncontrolled desire sprinkled in there. Okay? But it was to get us to the point of these holy couples and eventually to Christ himself. So the New Testament view of marriage changes everything, okay, and reveals to us kind of a new sacrament of marriage. So what changed? By the Lord's resurrection, procreation is not the primary goal of marriage. Before the resurrection of Christ, these couples that lived in the Old Testament, the only way to kind of extend their sense of immortality was through their children. Okay? Through their children. We still kind of do the same thing today. Okay? How? How many of you, do you have your grandfather's name? Did you get your grandfather's name? Did you get your grandfather's name?
Yeah.
Right. I got my grandfather's name. That's why I got stuck with Telemachos. Okay? I don't mind the saint. It's wonderful. But I didn't know I had a saint until I was 25. Okay? Because nobody's heard of Saint Telemachos. But Theodorus, nice name. How about you, John? Yeah.
Oh, not my grandfather's name. Yeah.
No?
No.
Okay. One of the twins have your parents' name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A girl
Our
has
daughter
her
and my
grandma.
mom's name.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And I was named after both my great grandmas.
There you go. Okay. So what does that mean? Is an attempt to immortality. Okay. Right, isn't it? That's what, my papa was Telemachos Alikakos of Constantine. I'm Telemachos Alikakos of Constantine. My dad and my son have the same name, exactly. First name, middle name, last name. Why? It's an attempt to immortality. It's whatever. It's something that's left over. But the point of procreation is no longer the primary goal, right? It's nice. It's a blessing, right? And sometimes it is treated as, the first son or the first son or the first daughter is treated that way as to carry on the name. So after the person is dead, they leave somebody behind. But that's not the point. It's a custom, but not a goal. Okay? So if you face issues on that front, right? I mean, unfortunately, you're going to have like 5 kids before you can just name one whatever you want, which is what we have 4 kids, and all of them have names that were imposed to us by our parents. Okay? And so that's what happens. But this attempt to immortality is, again, a remnant, right? No longer the primary goal, because the Lord's resurrection showed us what? That the goal of marriage shifts from attainment of eternal life by husband and wife and children. Okay? Not by procreation do you become immortal, but by being whole with each other and make sure that the children are also true images and made in the likeness of God. Okay? So the marriage is not just a construct by which you carry one generation after another, whether in general from Adam and Eve to Abraham, or specifically from Abraham to the Christ. Okay? If you notice from your scriptures, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke begin with genealogies. Gospel of Matthew begins from Abraham to the Christ. The Gospel of Luke begins from Adam to the Christ. But the whole history of that had to be basically done within the construct of marriage made for the purposes of procreation, and therefore having multiple wives or wives with concubines and so on and so forth. You'll see later on how these stories of the Old Testament are shown within the marriage service, but now they mean something else. Okay? So the shift is to providing a way for human beings to save their souls. So a couple is to be married only if the marriage or their partnership, they're joining their life together, is to lead to salvation. If it's for any other reason, don't bother. Likewise, right? The procreation of children should not just be because you had a little too much to drink one night. Okay? It should be a deciding factor is that we want to raise children to raise saints. Are we capable of raising children the way that God wants to raise them? Okay? Are we capable of raising children and make them saints? Make them citizens of the kingdom. Otherwise, what's the point? Right? We can bring up children to the world and have lots of dreams for them. We want them to be happy. We want them to be comfortable. We want them to have nice memories. We want them to have a good education. We want them to have a comfortable life. We want them to find a nice person, and so on and so forth. But if you think about those things in totality, they're all wonderful blessings. But what's the point if that's all we want? Are we just here to eat and then to drink and to be having some experiences and then meet somebody and then have a married life together just to bring up more people that will also eat and drink and have some experiences so they can grow up and then meet somebody? Right? That's not our life. Our life is, right? Find God, or allow God to find us. Sometimes you do that alone. We'll talk about it. Sometimes you do that with someone else, right? That's also interested in the same goal. And in that context, to also bring other people into this world, right? With God's design. Remember the last 2 couples, right? God actually intervened in their conception, right? With God's help, for God's purposes, and nothing else. All right? Nothing else. Not for companions, not to complete or, to kind of, I'm dreaming of having, 2.3 children. No, that's not the point. Is to make every effort that we're ready as a husband and wife to produce children according to the will of God. If our purpose is anything else, it's probably best to hold off. Okay? If we're not ready to do that, it's best to hold off. So, in your marriage service, we have rings and crowns. Those are to become the symbols, okay? Since your catechism class is what you expose to, right? Rings and crowns. Rings is for the engagement, right? And the marriage service has got the engagement, the betrothal part, and the crowning part. What are they about? Okay? Rings. Why do we have rings? There's rings all over the Old Testament, okay? rings are usually given as a sign of power, a sign of validation, a sign of a promise. Okay. So you have these figures that are mentioned in the wedding service. So those of you who are preparing for marriage, so you know what is in the wedding service. Those of you who already had it and you're wondering, like, why is the priest talking about Joseph and Daniel and Tamar and the prodigal son after they put rings on your fingers, right? Did you guys go over that before you got married? You know,
We did.
you did?
Yeah.
What do you remember?
Not a whole lot. So wasn't it
Okay.
all?
Uh-huh.
It was like pointing to the prodigal son. They put a ring on his finger when he came back.
Sure. Yeah, that's the most, because Christ gave that image. That's
Yeah.
kind of the more kind of vivid image, you know, even though you don't think of each other as a prodigal, right? It's like, it's like, how do you make that connection? It's all about elevating the other person, okay? Elevating or showing a sign of a promise. So Joseph was elevated in Egypt, right, by Pharaoh, right? Joseph interpreted some dreams for Pharaoh, and Pharaoh then, you know, the whole about the 7 cows, the skinny cows, the fat cows, right? The 7 years of famine, the 7 years of plenty. The way that Joseph managed the 7 years of plenty gave power to Egypt because they're the only ones in the area that had food. They basically took over the whole region because Joseph planned the 7 years of plenty to, you know, put Egypt in a position to take hold of, you know, to expand its kingdom. So the Pharaoh, in appreciation of Joseph, gave him a ring, make him, right? Give him power. Daniel, same thing, right? He was in Persia, and the king there gave him power because he interpreted some dreams and he pointed out some things to the king that gave the king power. So he gave it Daniel in the land of Babylon. He gave him a ring to show that he was in an elevated position. Now Tamar, anybody remember Tamar? Tamar, whatever. Messed up story. Okay, so Abraham gives birth to Isaac. Isaac gives birth to Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, including Joseph. Number 4 son, his name is Judah. Judah was the best boy of them all, right? If you remember the story about Jacob and his sons, and they were all jealous of Joseph. How did Joseph end up in Egypt? Because his other brothers basically tried to kill him. And then Judah says, don't kill him, just sell him to that, you know, he basically tried to save his life. And they sold him to slavery, and he went to Egypt, and the rest of the story is in Egypt. Now, Judah, okay, Judah, hey, how you doing? Doing well? You good? Okay. We having fun. So marriage of Manasseh, I brought my President with me, so make sure that I don't tell him any stuff that doesn't work. Yeah, keep me accountable. Sure, anytime. Anytime, Father.
You got the attendance slip sheet there.
We got to sign in? Okay, we'll make everybody sign before. All right, sounds good.
Anybody on Zoom?
Not that I know of. Yeah, okay. Thank you,
Have a
Father.
good night.
Thank you, Father.
I'm a
Thank
lock
you.
the front door, so.
We're locked in for the night. Are we here all night? Sounds good. Yeah, thank you, Father.
Let yourself out. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Judah has a few sons. One of his sons marries Tamar. Before she can have a kid, his son dies. And then the custom was that if you had taken in a daughter into your family, then if your son dies, then you have to give her the younger brother. The younger brother lies with Tamar. He's scared because, you know, his brother died really young. It's like something's wrong with his woman. So, you know, he decides to kind of fake marriage her. And, well, what ends up happening? He dies. Now, Judah is afraid to give her another son. It's like, wait a second, this lady's a wife killer. So it's like, you know, he had another son. It's like, well, wait for him to grow up. Why don't you stay with us and be, you know, a widow under my protection? Well, that's not what, you know, back then the law was, if you take somebody in and you give her your son, if your son doesn't give her any kids and he dies, you have to give her your other son. And if he dies, you have to give her the next one. So Judah was violating the custom of the time. Talk about, remember, marriage being not what we know it. Okay. So Tamar really messed up. Okay. She's living in the household of Judah as a widow. Well, she's like, wait a second, I'm supposed to marry the next son. My father-in-law won't give him to me, so I'm going to take matters in my own hand. So what does she do? She takes off her widow's clothes, dresses up as a prostitute, solicits herself to her father-in-law. Judah lies with her. Tamar's like, well, can I have something from you so that in case I do get pregnant? Doesn't know that it's Tamar. Has no idea. And says, can I have a ring from you? Right? And says, oh, yeah, well, I'll send you a young goat, but you can keep this ring until I find you. Okay? So she goes away with Judah's ring. Right? She goes away. She takes off her prostitute's clothes, put on widow's clothes. Right? And then she returning to the house. Next thing you know, she's got a belly. Oh, Tamar, she violated her oath. She slept with somebody else. It's like, I slept with my father-in-law. He wouldn't give me one of his sons, so I slept with him, even though he didn't know it. And there's his ring. Okay? So the ring, okay, talk about why the heck are we bringing up this at a marriage? You ever thought about it? If you really look at the story, it's like, why? I can see Joseph, Daniel, even the prodigal son. Prodigal son goes around, goes away, returns. God reinstates him. Okay? So we can see that a ring elevates. You elevate your wife, the wife elevates the husband, right? You're both elevated by giving a ring of power over each other, over your home. Okay? But it's also the power of a promise, okay, that you're given to each other. Judah, once you take a girl for your son, your promise is that you're going to keep giving her sons until a son is born. Now, the promise can be messed up in our standards, but a promise is a promise. Okay? A promise is a promise. And nothing can violate that promise. Okay? We take that promise all too lightly nowadays. Okay? But a promise in the eyes of God, okay, as messed up as the example might be, but it shows, and this is the first example of actually a public confession. Judah confessed, yes, I wronged this woman. Yes, I slept with her when I thought this was just a prostitute. Again, messed up in our heads. With modern standards, doesn't calculate this thing, right? It's probably more off than any soap opera we can ever imagine. Okay? I mean, these things would not be acceptable at all. But what's the bottom of this event? A promise is a promise. When you break a promise to each other, I don't care what happens. Okay? Nothing, as strange it may be, nothing can, relinquish you from the responsibility of that promise. Now you say, Father, what about things that happen within a marriage? There's abuse, there's adultery. So you can live apart. But a promise to help each other become whole is there. Okay? That never goes away. Okay? You can see, we talk about a little bit divorces coming up later, but, when you're apart, it doesn't matter. The promise you gave in front of God, not to each other. That's why there's no vows in the North Tech service. You don't give them the state of Illinois, or you don't give them Cook County, or to each other as a person. It's a promise to God. Your job is to make sure that other person goes to heaven. And vice versa. You may hate each other's guts. Okay? Because you've done nasty things. Sometimes one-sided, sometimes both. But a promise is a promise. I don't think anything can be worse than, your two sons, widow doing this. Okay? But she kept the ring. It's a promise, is a promise. Okay? So, crowns. One of the images that is brought up in a wedding service is about the crowns of the holy 40 martyrs. There's a lot of martyrs in the early church, even today. 20th century saw more martyrs than any other century in history. This particular case, right, is about these 40 soldiers in Sevastia, basically is what Asia Minor, Turkey is today. Turkey A, the way they want to be called now. So they were found out to be Christians. Summarily, they were condemned to death. And the way that the authorities decided to put them to death was by putting them in a frozen lake, okay, to freeze to death. So you see these 40 men basically thrown into this frozen lake, and they were there to endure until they are all dead. So next to the lake, they put this little bathhouse. You see it? So, see the little bathhouse here? So in case you change your mind and decide not to be a Christian anymore because, the lake was too cold, you can come out and we'll let you go into the bathhouse and warm yourself up and recover. So what happens, the soldiers are watching, these 40 martyrs inside the lake. And, after a while, one of them jumps out and goes into the bath. So you can see it going into the bath. Now, the soldier that was watching, he had this vision. He saw crowns descending from heaven, 40 of them, right? And they were descending one and ahead on each of these martyrs. Now, there were 40 crowns, and the soldier saw it and says, oh, there's 40 crowns, they're coming down. One of them is going to be, doesn't have someone to rest on. So what does he say? I'm a Christian too. Takes off his clothes, jumps in the lake, and he claims that 40th crown. Okay, so what was wrong with the person that jumped into the bath? Well, he couldn't endure this to the end. There's more to the story. That's what the bottom of the icon is. So when basically most of them had died, they decided to fish them out because they didn't want to wait out there either, even though they were not in the cold water, right, the soldiers. So they brought them all out, and they decided to kind of quicken their deaths in case some of them were still like half alive. So they started breaking their legs or piercing them, right? There was a young lad, this is this guy right here. He's a young lad that he was the youngest out of all of them, and his mother was actually right by this lake. And she wanted to make sure that her son stayed in the frozen lake and died as a martyr. Okay. So when they brought him out, her son being the youngest, he also was the most, quote unquote, alive. Okay. So when they brought him out, they started breaking their legs and piercing the rest of the soldiers. And then they put them on a cart to take their bodies and take them to another location and burn them. But this young lad, his mother was watching from afar. And when they saw him, they felt sorry for him because he was young. So he looked like he still had a breath in him, so they left him. Right? So his mother then took him and ran behind the cart to make sure that he was also included in the martyrs. She didn't kill him, but she wanted to make sure that he was not left out. As she was carrying him, her son died. And then she put his body onto the pile of the other bodies, and she was buried. He was burned with him. Again, strange story, right? This is the value of martyrdom. This is probably something for another class, right? But in her eyes, having a son who had the opportunity to be counted as a martyr was very important to her. She didn't want him dead. But what do we say? Your ultimate purpose for your children, as is for yourself, is to go to heaven. So she figured this was her son's opportunity, and perhaps if he did not die at this particular occasion with the rest of his comrades, who knows? She made sure that he lasted to the end. And this idea of the 40 holy martyrs, why they're brought up? One, because there's crowns, and there's crowns in the wedding service, right? There might be wreaths, but the idea of crowning is there. And the idea of crowning is to last till the end. To last till the end. The rest of your family, whether it's your mother or your father or your relatives or your brothers and your sisters, their job is to make sure you last till the end, right? This mother, she saw her son's fate to be tied with these 40 martyrs that received a crown from heaven. She wanted to make sure that her son lasted to the end. We give crowns in the marriage service because sometimes the crowns are crowns of glory. A lot of them, the crowns that Christ had was crown of thorns. Okay, being stayed in a marriage sometimes is as difficult as staying inside a frozen lake till the death. Okay, the job of your family is to make sure you stay in there. The job of your sponsors is make sure you stay in there, in your marriage. Whether it's a marriage of joy, or whether it's a marriage of, thorns, so to say, or difficulties. Okay. Again, we will talk about later. It's sometimes things happen, but a promise, what do we say, is a promise. Okay. Roles in marriage. Okay. Roles in marriage, again, what we read in a marriage. We read in a marriage service from the epistle of Paul to the Ephesians, always controversial, right? Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husbands to be the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church. He's the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. What do you think, Brez? Sounds good? Yeah. So what does that mean? Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church, gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word. He presents her to himself, glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle. So husbands ought to love their own wives as they love their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. Okay, so on and so forth. Again, you have different roles. Husband is the head, the leader, not a tyrant, right? Is to love his wife more than anything, right? To be selfless. He's to be obedient to God. If your husband is obedient to God, then a wife being obedient to the husband is the same as being obedient to God. A wife to respect her husband, to follow his lead, to be obedient as Christ was obedient to his father, not a slave, but not without a voice. Okay? And then, as depending on the maturity of the couple, these roles are interchangeable. Okay? But in all things, there should be one head. Okay? Now remember, why is it so? It's not what God intended. God created Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to watch out for each other. After the fall, you have constructs, right? The mystery of marriage, right, is to be a construct first for the procreation of the human race to the Christ, and then a construct in which we understand the mystery, the relationship between Christ and church. Okay? And Christ is the head of the church. Okay? There's always one head. The church is to be the bride of Christ. Now, that relationship, when there is maturity, right, and trust and, understanding of each other's strengths and weaknesses, they can be interchangeable. The idea is that there's always to be one head. What do we call a baby that is born with two heads? A problem. Okay, it would be an issue. It would be a health. It would be, I don't know, what would you call it? Okay, same thing with a couple. There's going to be one head, and whether you divide things in which one takes the lead of the other, but there's always be one lead. One has to be obedient to each other, and ultimately both obedient to God. Now, why does it specifically, Paul talks about the husband always being the head? Okay, just like it says later on, right? For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, the two shall become one flesh. That phrase is also interchangeable. The wife shall leave father and mother and be cling to her husband, the two shall be one flesh. They can be interchangeable. The idea is there's always to be a lead. There'll be mutual obedience to each other, but most of all, obedience to God first. And therefore, when you're obedient to each other, you're ultimately obedient to God. Okay? But to both turn your keys at the same time, being obedient to God, right, is difficult for a lot of things. So sometimes you follow the lead of the one, you follow the lead of the other. Okay? It's called spiritual maturity. Okay? Right? And to trust that that lead is indeed right? Obedience to God himself. Okay. So for that to happen, honestly, some of the things about marriage: honesty, acceptance, loyalty, some praise, right? Hey, you were right. Forgiveness. Sometimes you lead the wrong way. And time. And most important thing is time. We think that everything should be, okay, you're married about 2 years. Boom. No, it doesn't happen. It needs length of time and quality of time within that time. Okay. We think it's just things should happen automatically because, we were married in the church and God's grace somehow is going to resolve all our issues. No. Okay. You have to have all these 6, elements, but for all of them to develop, you need to spend time. Okay. Marriage is a long game. That's why, again, there's no vows. Vows typically have what at the end? I promise to do all these till death do us part. Do you hear that in an Orthodox service? No. There is no till death do us part. Remember, a promise is a promise and it's forever. Okay? Forever. You're always bound to the other. Forever. Now, there's no marriage in that sense in heaven. But you know who got you there. And it's Christ and it's your spouse. Okay? You're saved together or not saved together. You know who got you there. Either through joy or through patience. One or the other got you there. Okay? And all those 6 elements are important. But time, because our marriage is a long, long road. Both long in this life, hopefully. Right? Okay? My advice to young couples when they're having, I'm doing all the chores, I'm doing all the work, I'm doing all of this, and you do not know who's going to change each other's diapers at the end. Okay? You do not know these things. And you do not know how your marriage will develop over centuries in eternity. Never mind, we had a rough 5 years, or a rough 10 years, or a rough 20 years. Okay? Okay? It's a long, long, long game. So, some of the elements of marriage that, sometimes we don't talk about, okay? All of those 6 elements, honestly, and forgiveness and time, play within all these issues that we talked about, right? In marriage, remember, sex is not the point, it's not the legitimization of a sexual relationship. We're usually like, we kind of live together, have fun, and then make it right because we got married. It's not the point. That's not what marriage is. Okay? Or the free-for-all for sexual relationships. Even there is lines, right? Even there's lines. There's times to, to kind of, exercise other things within the marriage. Children, again, children are a blessing, not the goal of marriage. Okay, children only to be brought about when you're ready. Well, how do we decide, to do that? Birth control, right? What is the teaching about birth control, right? Well, ultimately, the only birth control that is accepted is abstinence. Okay, the church still does not believe in birth control, but that's something that you, with time and honesty and acceptance of each other, and in working with your spiritual father, where you go to confession, you can work those things out. The Orthodox Church doesn't have absolutes when it comes to these things. Okay? What is the goal of marriage? Is to keep your promise. Your promise is to lead each other to salvation. Okay? Even in divorce. What is divorce? Divorce is, we can't no longer live together. That doesn't mean that the relationship or the promise is dissolved. Even if you get a civil divorce or ecclesiastical divorce, right? You still, in your heart, are hoping and praying that the other person will keep the promise about you and you keep the promise about them, no matter what happens. Okay, dating, cohabitation, the stuff before marriage. Okay, again, right? How do you judge whether you should take your relationship, right, of meeting somebody, dating somebody, or living with somebody to the level of marriage, right? It's not just if you're attracted. It's not just if you gel together. It's not just if baby comes along, and so now you have to get married because baby's coming. Or not all those things. Those things happen. What is your number one goal? can I keep my promise with this person? Is this person going to help me, right, become whole? Is he going to help me be saved? Well, what happens when you have interfaith or, right, interjurisdictional, interdenominational marriages? What did he say before? It's best to have one faith in the family. It's definitely helpful. Okay. Can marriage be managed outside of that, like having different faiths? Can. More difficult. Okay. More difficult. At the end of the day, what do we say about other denominations or other faiths? It's one of my favorite lines was from a Serbian bishop of last century who says, I love all people, but, when I speak to non-Orthodox, I just can't guarantee your salvation. Okay? When we know and we believe that this is a path to salvation and this is my goal in life and my goal is to bring my spouse to the same salvation, well, then it's probably behooves us to kind of join together in that path. Makes it a lot easier. Okay. Alternative lifestyles, we talked a little about that. God drew the line there long, long, long time ago. Okay. So that should never be called marriage. It should never be just the only label we'll put on people. Okay. And we should not say, alternative lifestyles, when they're called marriages, it degrades the institution of marriage. Like, no, we don't say those things. Okay. We don't say those things. God drew the line of what is marriage and what is not. Okay. But that's not the only label that we should put on people, whether they're straight or they're not straight, all those things. So, alternative lifestyles, they are what they are. They are other, identity, how a person identifies in terms of the sexual orientation. Still a child of God. We just don't call it marriage. Okay. So that will never happen, within the Orthodox Church because God has drawn that line. Like I said, one of the first lines he drew. Okay. So marriage is a path to salvation. There's nothing else really that matters. Who was the first person to enter the gates of paradise? In the icon here, you see the thief, right? On the cross, where he was crucified next to Christ, and you turn to Christ, says, remember me when you come into your kingdom, right? Right. That's the first person to enter the paradise. So the path to paradise is open again. Whether you're single or you're married, right? The idea is to turn to Christ with your open heart and say, please remember me when you come into your kingdom. That's how you enter. Questions so far? I gave you a whole lot. Just kind of, okay? Any questions to? Ryan's gonna have to take the class again. When times get married, it's like, see, no, that's kidding. What do you think so far? What are your questions so far? Huh? You guys are good? Yeah. Say no objections?
No, just don't hold me back. I'm just kidding.
Huh?
I'm just kidding.
Say a promise is a promise. Okay, remember that. Okay, no matter what happens. Okay. All right. So monasticism as marriage. It's a different kind of marriage. Okay. You're still called the bride, right? Whether you're a guy or a girl, you're still called the bride. You marry Christ directly because he's the one that makes you whole, whether you're married, whether you go into monasticism. This is a prayer from Tantring of a monk, right? It says, Holy Lord of hosts, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, bless your servant, so, whom you have called to your spiritual bridal chamber, and make him wholly worthy to be your holy servant. Make him wise and pour out on him the grace and understanding of your ruling spirit. Grant him strength in the war against the invisible enemy. Put down with the great power the rebellions of the flesh. Grant him to please you in unceasing praise and doxology and appropriate hymns and acceptable prayers and right counsel, in the humble heart and the practice of life and meekness and truth. Make him utterly worthy to praise you, to please you in meekness, in love, in perfection, in knowledge, in courage, to offer to you hymns and doxologies and prayers in the odor of fragrant smell. Perfect his life in holiness and righteousness, so having continuous spotless union which is with you, you may be found worthy of your heavenly kingdom. Okay? So when you look at these, the different words, right? Meekness, love, perfection, courage, knowledge, right? I mean, all useful, right, within the marriage relationship. Okay, so monasticism is basically this calling of being married to Christ himself. The expectations are the same. Now, we bring this up because, yes, there's similarities in the monasticism and marriage, but we think of monastics. Have you been to a monastery? Have you ever visited? You visited?
Yeah.
Over where at?
Oh, one in
Yeah.
Racine, Kenosha.
In Racine, Kenosha? Okay, Kenosha. How about you?
In Greece, but
In Greece.
yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I mean, especially growing up in a Greek Orthodox household, we have this idea that there's a different standard, right? So monasticism is basically a path to the same destination, right, as marriage. And just instead of another person as your partner, you have just Christ. So cut out the middleman, in other words. Okay? Goal's the same. The expectations are the same. Whether you're in a marriage or monasticism, whether you're in the world or drawn out into a desert, into a community of monks and nuns, is the same. Now, a monk understands that, and a nun understands that. What we sometimes don't understand as married people or people living in the world, that we hear the teachings of the church, especially about prayer and forgiveness or fasting or devotion or worship services or, the lifestyle we should live. And what is a common, if you see like somebody going to church all day, oh, what does he want to be, a monk? Oh, those are for monks or nuns. These fasting rules are for someone else, either for clergy or for monks and nuns, right? And there is no two standards. There are no two standards, right? Just like monasticism and marriage are basically paths to the same goal, there's no two different standards or expectations of what our life should be. St. John Chrysostom, again, a father of the 4th century, right? He writes, 5th century, you greatly delude yourself in error if you think that one that is demanded from a layman and another from a monk, since the difference between them is in whether one is married or not, while in everything else they have the same responsibilities, because all must rise to the same height. And what has turned the world upside down is that we think only the monk must live rigorously, while the rest of us are allowed to live a life of indolence. There are no two standards. Okay, so while we kind of talk a little bit about monasticism and how it is another type of marriage, okay, we speak of it as another type of marriage so that we understand that the expectations of a monk or a nun in a monastery in a desert are not different, right, than the life of a husband and wife in the world. They're not different. They are exactly the same. The goal is the same, therefore their expectations are the same. Okay? One is not a higher life than another. Okay? They're all, right? We're all called to become whole, to become inheritors of the kingdom of heaven. There's no two different sections in heaven, one for monks and nuns, the other for married people. Marriage does not either give you an excuse to live a lesser life or to live a life that's considered lesser by the church or by God. Okay? That's why there is no, in the Orthodox Church, there's no restriction of married people to the priesthood, right? There never was. Okay? Because marriage doesn't make you a second-class citizen. Does not make you, to relieve you of your obligations as a Christian in terms of your formation to become whole, right, to restore the image and likeness of God. Okay? Having, sexual relations, with your spouse does not make you somewhat lesser or dirtier or more corrupt, or less of a Christian, and therefore less is expected of you. The same is expected of you. Okay? Because marriage is not something of, might be a construct, so to say, but it's a mystery, it's a sacrament to lead you back to salvation. Okay? Just as monasticism, obviously, is like, what's the point of monasticism if you don't get saved? You give up everything, right, for salvation, and then you end up not being saved. You think, oh, that's a bummer. At least I got married, so I got to enjoy it. No, it's like, what's the point of getting married if you don't get saved? It's just as preposterous to say somebody became a monk and a nun and didn't get saved, right? You think, oh, what a bummer. right? You threw away everything, and you left your family. You didn't get married. You didn't have children, and you left all your stuff behind. He ended up not being saved. Would not be thinking of a bummer? It's just, and we said, well, they were married. They had their life. It's okay. They're in hell. No, it doesn't work that way, right? Do we ever think that way? So why would the standards be different? Why would the expectations be different? Marriage doesn't make you less of a person or less being expected of you because you are in the muck of everyday responsibilities or in a flesh relationship, because it's not about the flesh relationship. In the Old Testament, yeah, it's messed up, but it's there to bring to Christ. It's within a construct which was sanctified by the time, right, Christ comes along. And Christ indeed sanctified it and made it only for salvation. Okay? And just would be a bummer to say, oh, got married and didn't find salvation. Well, at least I had children to carry on my name. What's the point of carrying on your name if your name is in hell? If it's not in the book of life. Okay? So we understand that. The standards are, so don't let anybody ever say to you, oh, you're married, therefore you are less. Again, why? In the Orthodox Church always remained, from the beginning of the church till today, that marriage does not preclude you from serving as priest. Say, well, Father, how about bishops? Bishops could be married up to a certain point, basically 5th century. What happened? What happened to the office of bishop? Why did it become sort of a celibate or a widower, right? Why? Because bishop's office is the most sort of comprehensive office, right? It's the most powerful office. You ordain other people. Bishops elect other bishops. So what is always a problem when a bishop has a family, has a few sons, he makes them priests, or he makes them bishops, and then next thing you know, the church is like Cook County. It's just, it's like passing from father to son to son to son. So nepotism. So in order to make sure there was no nepotism in the church, okay, plus the fact that the office of bishop, once the church started to grow out of the persecutions, responsibilities are so great, that it wouldn't be fair for that person to have a family either. It didn't work out very well because, the demands were too high. You're looking over an entire area rather than just one parish, right? So anyway, long story short, for practical purposes, bishops are celibate. Not because not being married makes you eligible for higher office. It's got nothing to do with it. It was only for practical purposes. Okay? Only for practical purposes, not an affront to that marriage makes you something less. Which unfortunately what happened in Roman Catholicism after the schism, and that's why even to this day you have celibate priesthood in Roman Catholicism. Because, the idea crept into Roman Catholic Church that, marriage makes you something less. Not officially so, but in practice, yes. Okay? Marriage makes you something less. Okay? And that was never the case. And the expectations are always the same. So early history, how did monasticism come to be as a lifestyle? Right? In the Old Testament, it didn't really exist. Okay? Right? Just like other things did not exist, or even the mystery of marriage was not really understood. It began with John the Baptist. Okay? John the Baptist left to the desert, lived a life of poverty. Right? He had nothing. He had camel hair for clothes, and he ate locusts and so forth. Right? So he lived out in the desert, preaching the word of God, waiting to see the Christ and baptize him. So it started out with him. Then St. Paul kind of continued down the line. St. Paul was never married. So his teaching is like, well, if you're not married, just kind of stay that way. Okay? Be like me, kind of be unencumbered, just kind of live your life because Christ's coming back. And sometimes might be easier to kind of live, dedicate your life directly to God, just like I have. Okay? But also, he's the same person that wrote the epistle that we read in marriage service. So it wasn't like abolishing marriage. But in a sense, he says, well, our goal is salvation, and Christ is coming soon. So, if you're married, wonderful, but if you're not, stay that way. So that's where you're right. That's kidding. So then You have 300 years come by, go by in church history. You have the end of the persecutions, and then you have the church then become the official religion of the empire, the Roman Empire. And now Christianity is no longer punishable by death. In fact, it's the official religion now becomes fashionable to be Christian. So you have this explosion of the population of the church, right? And where before, imagine going from a church where becoming a Christian could cost you your life, right? It could cost you your livelihood, it could cost you your family, it could cost you your life, right? You could be put in prison and fed to the beasts. So needless to say, when somebody became a Christian in the first 3 centuries of the church, they were kind of like, hardcore, right? You had to be, right? You had to be hardcore. Now it's fashionable. The emperor is Christian. My boss is a Christian. My mailman is a Christian. My policeman is a Christian. And it's if you want to be with everybody else, now it's okay to be a Christian. And some people were still hardcore, but a lot of people that came into the church came because why not? Okay, so what did it do? It kind of watered down the purpose of the church. The church was there full of people that every day could be their last day because the Roman army could come into your church, discover your underground church, and kill you off. So there, when you exchange a kiss of peace at the liturgy, you really meant it because it'd be the last time you saw each other. And there was that intensity of the Christian experience. That intensity, once the persecutions were over, and every time Dick and Harry became a Christian, kind of watered down. So a lot of people then sought out that kind of more intense life away from the world. And so you have the birth of what we call this monasticism out and, removed from society. Just because they're removed from society doesn't mean that you can't live that life in the world. But some people found it not easy to be completely unencumbered. So you have this celibate life out in monastic communities. At the beginning, it was just living in the desert. St. Anthony was one of them. St. Anthony went to church one day. St. Anthony had a great wealth. At the age of 18, his parents die. He has a sister, and he has incredible amounts of money. Doesn't know what to do with his life. Goes to church one day. He hears the certain ruler asked Jesus, saying, "Good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" So Jesus says to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God, but one that is God. You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness. Honor father your mother." He said, "All these things I kept from my youth." So when Jesus heard these things, he said to him, "You still lack one thing. Sell all that you have, distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come follow me." Of course, this young man doesn't follow Jesus because he couldn't get rid of his wealth. St. Anthony took this literally and says, "I'm going to get rid of my wealth, go out to the desert, just get rid of everything and do what Jesus says to these young men." Sold everything he had, gave his sister her portion, and then he went to the desert and lived there for the next 85 years or so. Okay? Just living a life of prayer. Just didn't want to deal with property, didn't want to deal with all the responsibility. And he lived what we call, he married Christ. He says, "I'm going to go out and desert, be by myself." And so other people started to follow him, right? And living sort of this kind of life in caves in the desert. So you have the birth of what we know as modern day monasticism, right? Through St. Anthony the Great. And many people will follow him afterwards. St. Pachomius was one of them. St. Pachomius, he invented a different kind of monasticism called Cenobitic, meaning that bunch of monks living together like a brotherhood. Okay, they lived in their own huts, but they had a common life in prayer. They worked in common. They have common revenues and expenses, common meals, wear the same garb, right? And there was no vows at that time. They just identifies people seeking perfection, meaning seeking a life with God. Okay, again, a life that could be lived in the world. Okay, but these people, monastics, men and women, start to try to seek their life out in either communities of people or by themselves in deserts and caves and so on and so forth. Okay, again, a life of prayer, a life where you kind of let go of your worldly possessions, okay, and have no family to raise, or no, not married to a spouse, but rather married directly to God. Again, expectations still the same. Many people would follow, right? St. Basil the Great, right, coming from a family of martyrs, he also lived in a monastic community. He founded a monastic community, was a community of philanthropy, a community of prayer, right, a community of study, right? Many again will follow. St. Maximus the Confessor would be one of them. This guy right here, right? And St. Theodore the Studite, who had the monastery of Studius, which was actually in Constantinople. Not all monasteries were in the desert, okay? A lot of them were in the cities, but this basically provided environments for people to support each other as they lived alone, seeking a life of perfection in Christ. Out of that school would come St. Simeon, the new theologian, and then eventually St. Gregory Palamas, the teaching of hesychasm, the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ have mercy on me, how to pray ceaselessly. Okay, so all these figures are figures of monasticism, how monasticism developed from living out in the desert to monastic communities in the desert or monastic communities in the cities themselves. And then, how many of you have been, gentlemen, been to Mount Athos? Mount Athos became a peninsula in Greece, which was dedicated, it said that, the Virgin Mary complained to Jesus that she didn't have a land that she called her own. So Jesus gave her this peninsula in northern Greece, which the only woman to step on this island would be the Virgin Mary herself. Anyway, it's basically an area restricted only to men. You only have men's monasteries in this Mount Athos. And there's 20 monastic communities that have been there for over 1,000 years. Okay, so it's a center of monasticism. From there, monasticism spread all over Greece, all over the Balkans, all over Russia and Ukraine, and all over the world. And one of those monks was Elder Ephraim, that was from monastery of Philotheo in Mount Athos. And one day he decided to come to America. And what did he do? He decided to build the monastery of St. Anthony's in Arizona. This is this monastery here. And from there, we have now 24 monastic communities, just basically founded by this one man that brought that style of monasticism to the United States. Okay, now the United States has all these little dots are all monastic communities of different orders. Some of them from Yerod Ephraim, others are from other monastics. Okay, they come from Greece or come from Europe, or they come from all over the world to form monastic communities here in the United States. Chicago has plenty. We have two from Yerod Ephraim. One is Transfiguration, the other one is St. John Chrysostom. But you have the Serbian monasteries. You have Gracanica, you have St. Sava, you have Romanian monasteries over in Northwest Indiana and in Michigan. So there's monasteries in the United States, which are, really the monasteries serve to be that, again, a context for people that want to follow that married life, and life married to Christ directly, a life of prayer, a life where you leave kind of what we call earthly, responsibilities behind. Not that they're lesser, they're just taking on different kind of relationship to Christ. And again, this monasticism is worldwide. Can never, not be, remiss to not say the monastic tradition that comes out of Russia, right? And the Ukraine, the Optina saints and Seraphim of Sarov. These are all 19th century saints of our church, monastic saints. But even St. John Chrysostom, which somebody would consider monastic even though he was married. He lived a life of a monk where he had possessed nothing, right? So, the joke was always that they would tell his, whenever he would go out to pick up groceries, and they would tell his wife, don't send your husband to pick up groceries because he'll give them away before he gets home. Okay, so he can never keep any of his possessions on him. He was always kind of living the life, let's say, of unattached to anything, even though he was married. And there was nothing wrong with that, because again, right, the life of a monk or a nun, right, is not really meant to be different than somebody who's a husband and wife. Okay. We think of them as two different classes of people, but they're not. Okay? The expectations are the same because the goal is the same. And that's the idea, right? Either you're crowned as a husband and wife, or you're tonsured as somebody who is, right, dedicated directly as a bride to Christ, right? Both the married and the monastic life demands sacrifice and dying to oneself. While the single person may offer some extensively in the service of others, it is always a willing offering of self and not one imposed by another. The monastic submits himself in obedience to superior, doing what he is told, when he is told, and how he is told, and is not following his own will. The married person submits himself to the needs and the desire of his spouse and to their children. Okay? So regardless, right, this idea of being obedient to God, obedient to each other, obedient to a brotherhood, or obedient to the needs of a family, right? How do you become whole, right? You empty yourself. You deny yourself, right? What Jesus says, you want to come after me, deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me, and I will make you whole. I will save you. If you want to be saved, do this. Whether you do it in a community of monastics, you do it in the desert, or you do it in the little church called your home as a husband and wife, you all require the same, you all have the same expectation. Okay? And the mystery of marriage is complete once we understand it in that way. Okay? What Christ does for his church, right, we are to do for each other. Okay? We have to do for each other. That's how we become whole, by emptying ourselves, right? As husbands and wife. You know, you come to me 10 years from now and says, as a husband says, I'm not happy. I'll say, well, that's not important to me. If you say my wife's not happy, then that's a conversation. Because you're supposed to, you know, it's like a monk say, I'm not happy. We're like, aren't you living a life, right, dedicated to the brotherhood, dedicated to this community, dedicated to Christ? Okay. Now, if you say my brother or my spouse or my superiors, right, is not happy, I'm not fulfilling everything that they need, then you have to challenge yourself. Okay. In a marriage, just like in monasticism, the calling is the same. Deny yourself, pick up your cross or your rings or your crowns or your monastic garb, and follow me. Okay. Those things constitute your cross. Okay. The only difference in a marriage, the two of you get to share the lifting. Okay? In a monastic community, sometimes you lift it alone, but sometimes you lift it as part of the brotherhood. Okay? But you lift your cross nevertheless. Okay? So marriage and monasticism, really two paths to salvation. Okay? Again, I know I throw a lot of you. I'll throw a lot out at you, but if you have any questions? Huh? You're all good? You can, I guess you can always go back and review the slides on the YouTube. I don't know if there's a Parish channel that is posted on. I'm not sure. Okay, and yeah.
When you talked about Adam seeing Eve when she had the oral, is that something the fathers talk about? That's not in Genesis. Like it's not spelled out like that, right?
It's not spelled out.
I never heard that before. That was really.
Yeah, Abraham. I mean, basically, Adam at that moment becomes a prophet because how did he know if he was asleep? Yeah. How did he know that God actually took her out of him? But it wasn't that, you know, again, missing the rib. He just basically what he saw was another human being who was like him, not physiologically, other than that she walked on two legs, but she was very different. Right? They weren't the same. What was the same was the light. Okay. That's what was the same. That's why he said what he said, because she was right. She carried with her the light, right, which surrounded, like when we see icons, right? We see that menorah behind the icon, right? She had that, just like he did, and he had not seen that in anyone else because no one else had a soul. Nobody else was made in the image likeness of God. Only he was, and then she was. Yeah, and that's why he said what he said. Yeah, physiologically, he had more in common with an ape than he did with a woman. Okay? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right? All good? Okay. Are you enjoying Greater and Holy Land? Huh? 5th week and 6 weeks are the hardest. Okay? I know. I was served in Iowa for 3 years, and somebody that came was married to a Russian woman, and she really made him fast to Atlanta. So he came to me and said, Father, I grew up in a farm. Meat and potatoes, really, it just became more. I love the church, but what do you have against meat? So, but again, Lent is a great time to kind of quiet things down and discover things about each other as couples or, ourselves. And where our relationship to God stands and whether we are proceeding towards salvation or not. And you can't do that when you're always running. So Great Lent is a great excuse to kind of slow things down. Okay. Well,